Welcome to Praise Hands, home of the Praise Hands, where we are all about creative, cross-cultural Christianity. This episode is brought to you by thechurchahead.com, resources and advice for forward-thinking Christian leaders. Welcome to episode 2. Today we'll be discussing multiculturalism, worship, and the church, and we'll hear from two respected voices on the topic of multicultural worship. I'd like to dedicate today's show to someone very near to my heart, my cousin Allie Perla. Her courageous fight against brain cancer inspired thousands, and today she is celebrating 1 year in heaven with Jesus. Allie, I love you very much, and I hope you've got great Wi-Fi in heaven and are smiling as you listen to this show. As I mentioned last week, it broke my heart to see such a contrast between the cross-cultural ministry of Jesus in the early church and what we see in the majority of today's worship music. As I thought and prayed, I realized that multicultural church music will not happen until we have multicultural churches. Soon after, Mark Diamaz, affectionately known as the multi-ethnic church guy, connected me with Nikki Lerner and the Multicultural Worship Leaders Network. She's become a friend, and we are thrilled to have her on the show today. Our second guest is Grammy-Award winning producer Chris Baker. Chris's latest project is with the recording collective by MultiTracks.com and is a resource for multicultural congregations around the world. Additionally, he serves as the musical director for Israel Houghton and as a worship pastor along with his wife Tina at the Potter's House in North Dallas. Without further ado, let's jump right in. Thank you guys both so much for being here. Nikki Lerner's here from the Baltimore, Maryland area. Hello, Nikki.
Hello. Good to be here.
And we've got Chris Baker here. You're in from Dallas, Texas area, is it?
Yeah, I'm in Dallas, man. Cowboy country.
Okay. Well, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in the Joe Montana, Steve Young days, so we'll have to talk offline about that.
I'm a Drew Brees fan, but we're not going to talk about that today.
And I'm actually a New England Patriots fan, so hey, go figure.
Man. I didn't think it could get any worse.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, man. Well, we're going to jump right in here. Chris, you get the first question. You've worked with a wide variety of artists, including legends like Marvin Sapp, Fred Hammond, Israel Houghton. Israel in particular has been a significant bridge builder between the Black gospel and the white CCM communities in America and even across the world. Can you share a story of when you've seen the gospel transcend cultural differences?
Wow. Yeah, man. I can say I was born and raised in church, so I've always seen the power of just the gospel and just music and just the power of just Jesus, period. So no stranger to it. But I think it was my first trip to Paris. It was probably about 15 years ago. I walked in the church and they were singing a melody to a song that sounded extremely familiar. But because I don't speak French, I didn't know what in the world they were saying. But I could see that same power that resonated in my church in North Carolina, where I was at the time, was resident in Paris. And what they were singing Israel's Lord, You Are Good.
Sure.
And I said, this is amazing because we don't just serve a gospel God or a contemporary Christian God.
Right.
We serve a really big God that he's so much bigger than the box that sometimes we put him in. And so it was in that service that it was really like an eye-opening experience to the true power of how music and the power of worship can transcend so many cultural barriers and language barriers and all of those types of things. So that was probably my first encounter to kind of see and experience that.
Yeah, that's great. I'm sure you've seen a few things traveling around the world playing. You guys actually met Nikki and Chris in New Zealand at a conference, which is just wild, of all places.
Yeah. It was a great conference about 2 years ago, and just phenomenal conference. And again, of course, they're English-speaking country, but it's still the culture is different, and there's some differences. But at the end of the day, it's just the power of Jesus and His name is transcendent. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Nikki, you lead something called the Multicultural Worship Leaders Network. I got to attend your yearly conference a few months back in Abington, Maryland, and it was incredible. And I wanted to have our listeners get to hear a little more about that. Why did you start this network, and how do you hope that the world will be changed for the better in, say, 20 years as a result of it?
Sure. And thanks for coming, by the way.
You're
We
welcome.
time together. So a couple of colleagues and myself started this network several years back. We were invited by a mutual friend to a retreat for about 15 to 20 worship pastors from around the country that our mutual friend thought that we all needed to know each other because we were all doing ministry in intentional multicultural contexts. And he thought it was a shame that people didn't know one another. And it was beautiful because we met each other there for the first time. And I know for me, I'd been doing ministry for about, 10 years up until that point. I hadn't met many people that were doing the kind of work that I was doing in my church. Again, just intentionally multicultural ministry. Because where we live here in Maryland, churches are still very racially segregated.
Sure.
They are all over the country, but particularly over here, where we are. So our church being intentionally multicultural, it was great to meet some people that were doing the same thing. And so after that retreat, when we all got together and we just met for the first time, we said, if we needed this, obviously other people would need this too. And so to make a really long story short, we put together the Multicultural Worship Leaders Network.
Yeah.
Really to inspire, to equip, to network, and to resource leaders, worship leaders, pastors in churches that are intentionally multicultural, multi-ethnic, because even still in 2019, our churches are pretty racially segregated. And, people who do the kind of work that we do, they need to know that they're not crazy.
Right.
I mean, they're crazy, but not crazy. And that they're not alone. And so our network is pushing forward to create resources, both through training and music and experience to help people continue to learn how to lead cross-culturally and to lead only their own people group.
Right. So one of the reasons I was so excited to have you both on this podcast today is to really have two seasoned, trusted perspectives on not that season's, but two trusted perspectives on the topic of multicultural worship. So Nikki, when you say multicultural worship, what does that mean? Does that mean you get like a Black person on stage, you get a white person on stage, and you get a Hispanic person, and then you just clap your hands and say, "Yay, we did it"? Or is there more to it than that?
Yes, because it's all about optics. No, I'm joking. No, so I will answer that question this way. Our model of worship in the New Testament, our only model of worship that was actually a vision, came from the Apostle John in Revelation chapter 7. And when he saw that vision, he saw people, a crowd that he couldn't even count, from every tribe, every nation, every language, every tongue. And what he didn't see was, I looked and I saw this vision, and, at 10 o'clock, the white church started and went until 11 a.m. And then, at 11 a.m., the Black church started and they ended at 2. And then, and then the Korean church, they met, but they met in the basement.
Right.
Like that's not the vision. The vision of New Testament worship, the believers coming together, is the fact that they are together. They're worshiping at the same time together, bringing every piece of who they are. He didn't just mention colors. John mentioned an embodiment of God's people, which the body of Christ is already diverse. And so when we say multicultural worship, what we mean is not only when you look at a group of people, do you see the beautiful diversity that God has made, but that in that worship, through word, through prayer, through music, through preaching, that you actually can get a taste of who that person is culturally, what they bring to the worship experience. That, we believe in the work that we do is critical to making sure that we see as many aspects of who Christ is as possible.
Right. No, that's great. So one follow-up question on that, when I've talked about multicultural worship before, one of the questions that I've received is, okay, well, I get that every tribe, every tongue, every nation, but if we have everybody worshiping together, as one church at the same time, aren't they all just going to start having babies and we're just going to be one, mixed race and no, there's going to be no distinction? I mean, that's, if you look like 50, 100 years ago when a lot of Christian colleges were banning interracial marriages, that was some of the same, some of the same logic that was being used. Can you speak to that?
Yes. And the reality is that that's happening anyway. I mean, that is the world that we live in, right? I'm interracially married.
Right.
Our world, there now in 2019, there are more couples like mine and like Chris's family than anybody else. Yeah. I mean, there are more people like that, and as our world continues to change, there will be more people that are beautiful mixes of all kinds of colors and all kinds of come-froms. And so our task now is to make sure that we are creating communities of faith that are ready to be ready to accept, not only to accept, but to empower, empower the people of God as we continue to change.
No, that's a great answer. So that actually dovetails into the next question I was going to ask. Here at Praise Hands, our logo is the praise hands, or the raised hands emoji, featuring one darker skinned hand and one lighter skinned hand. And you mentioned interracial marriages and things like that. And I think each of you both are in interracial marriages, and I'm actually the product of one. You also mentioned earlier that most churches still in 2019 are racially segregated. I think the stat that a lot of people refer to is around 92% or so. I'll open this up to both of you guys. Is that the natural way that God designed culture to function? Everybody being, totally separate in these different kind of tribes. You're here. Or is the separation something that actually, and it's a segregation, is that something that actually breaks God's heart?
I just, from my perspective, I can't see how a God that is as intentional as he is in creation, and if you just read Genesis, you can just see the level of intention of God. I can't see how he would intend for us to come and worship him, which is to set aside time when we come to church to worship him, and we would be okay with being completely in our own tribe.
Right.
I have a hard time wrapping my head around it. Here's why. If you look at any other facet of life, whether it be the workplace, whether it be the schools, whether it be gyms, whether it be any other facet of our lives, you won't see. You see it, but it's most of them are integrated. It's not like you're going to walk into a gym and it's an all-white gym and everybody's cool that it's an all-white gym. Or
that'd be kind of scary if you walk in there. It's like, what kind of place is this?
What's going on here? What am I missing? So I do think that is something that breaks God's heart. I think that as worship pastors, as pastors, we can be somewhat enamored with building our version of God's church as opposed to building, the church that Jesus came and died for. Right. And so when we're building our version of it, then sometimes we're not really concerned with what breaks God's heart. We're concerned with how many butts are in seats. Yeah. And so that becomes the focus. Because if we were concerned with what breaks God's heart, and I feel that lack of diversity and segregation is something that breaks God's heart, then as a local pastor, as a worship pastor, it will be at the very forefront of my focus to make sure that I am intentional about creating a multicultural experience. Most of the time we talk about multicultural experience and we are accepting to all people, all creeds. But that's not true, because if I was to go home with you, you probably don't have any friends that don't look like you. If I was to look in your phone, all of your contacts, they are the same skin tone as you. If I was to listen to your music, your music would be something that is comparable to people that look like you. So one thing that you cannot fake is authenticity. And if you're going to be multicultural and it's going to be intentional, then it has to be an authentic experience. If not, people can walk in And I don't care if you put red, yellow, black, and white on your stage.
Mm-hmm.
It will be a forced fit because you're trying to sing a gospel song, but I can see you really don't have a clue what the essence of this gospel song is about. And so because it's not authentic, I cannot connect to it.
Mm-hmm.
So if God is intentional, if God is authentic, I think it does break his heart to look at his churches on Sundays or Saturdays whenever we meet, and to see that we're okay with it being just my tribe and we're good.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's great. It's been noted that virtually anywhere the adjective Christian is used, whether that's, not just churches, but even Christian schools, Christian music, you can find economic and racial segregation. Why do you guys think this is?
That is a very complex question.
It is.
And I believe.
And if you don't agree with that, you can push back as well too.
Well, for me, it's not an agree or disagree. I think you have raised several different types of institutions that have their own unique complex issue.
Sure.
So let me just say that first of all, in the spirit of not wanting to be flippant or dismissive.
Right.
Because we all know that it is normal for human beings to want to flock to what they can identify with.
Right.
Yes.
So that in itself is just normal. That's kind of human nature. And there's a lot of studies even on the brain that says that that's just kind of the normal way of the human being. So just one thing to say there. So there's that. The other thing is, let's just stay in the church realm. We might open up a can of worms, but I think, in these days in the contemporary church, we have slowly and sometimes unintentionally morphed into creating a church that is centered around our preferences. Chris alluded to it when he was speaking about it before, that sometimes our churches have become things centered around things that maybe God may not even care about, but that we care about living here in our experience on the earth. And so when church becomes about our preference, that's when we get in trouble. And that's why we stay separate, because it actually starts to cultivate what is natural for us anyway, which is flock together. I had lunch today with a friend of mine who pastors in Baltimore, and we were having this conversation even about how we plant churches. I mean, there is a whole philosophy out there, the homogeneous church principle,
right? HEP.
Right? Where you have all of these church planters that are awesome people flocking into places with the teaching of almost like in a business sense, to say who's your target demographic.
It's all sociology, marketing.
Yeah, I mean the fastest way to grow a church is not to make it multi-ethnic.
Right.
I mean, trust me on this. That's the slowest way to build a church. But one thing I do know is that when we work towards intentional multicultural ministry, it's one of the things we don't have to pray about. Like, we don't have to pray and ask Jesus, should we do ministry cross-culturally?
Sure. Because
it's already there. Yes is always the answer to whether or not this is the work that we should engage in. And if someone doesn't even want to receive it from a biblical from a social perspective, biblical perspective, even from a social perspective in 2019, churches, we love the word relevant, particularly in worship ministries when we're trying to defend our music choices. We love the word relevant. I don't want to sing that song anymore because it's old. Like, we can't do As the Deer. It's not relevant.
Right? Sure.
Right.
Relevant to who? Yeah.
Right. Well, that's always the question, relevant to whom. But also in 2019, you could argue that having a segregated church is probably the most irrelevant you could get. Now, again, that is a loaded statement I just said.
Right. Well, I mean, if I walk into Target and I only see all one ethnicity, one race there, I'd be like, what's going on here?
Yeah. And also, let me just say, to add to the conversation, that there are very good reasons for ethnic churches in our country. So let me just say that. But I will also say that, it's 2019. I mean, we have the answer through Christ, who is the unifier, for what's happening right now. And the church is still scared.
Well, I want to follow up on one thing that you said, and Chris, feel free to chime in this as well. You mentioned the social reasons for people that are wondering what are the biblical reasons for having, the topic of this episode is multiculturalism, worship, and the church. So why is cross-cultural ministry something you don't have to pray about, biblically speaking?
Well, I would add that it's everywhere, Robbie. Doing ministry cross-culturally is everywhere. Stories about Peter's experiences in Acts, that the Holy Spirit has revealed to him, his interaction with the Ethiopian eunuch.
Right.
And then there are Paul's letters to the churches. There are scriptures like Philippians 2 that says, prefer one another as better than yourself. There are scriptures, the whole book of Ephesians, if you read it through the lens of intentional multicultural ministry and just relate.
You being plural.
Yeah, cross-culturally, it's everywhere. In the book of Corinthians, it says that our ministry, the ministry is of reconciliation, right. Of reconciling people back to God and then people with each other. Like, that is our ministry. So it's everywhere. It'd actually be a more intensive practice to try to find some scriptures that would tell us this is not the heart of God, right. rather than it is.
Yeah. Do you have anything on that, Chris?
No, it's just, I think preference eats ministry for breakfast. And it boils down to preference. It really boils down. We are more committed to our preference as we are to really being what Christ called us to be, man. I mean, I don't think it's complicated. I'm not saying that because my wife is white and we have mixed kids and all of that. I have a hard time wrapping my head around it being okay. I don't know. It's just for me to wrap my head around it being okay for us to still be cool with. My preference is being in church with people that look like me, and it's okay. Because that's not the way it is in any other facet of my life. I can see if that was consistent in every other area of my life. Like my kids went to an all, one race school. That's not the case in any other area. But when it comes to church, I think we're overcomplicating it. Even though I know it's a complicated matter, but I think it really boils down to, like, Nikki said, it's a preference thing. And so the question is, am I more committed to my preference or am I more committed to building God's church?
Right. So here's a question on that. Yeah, no, and I think that's spot on. If you could snap your fingers and magically have every Christian leader have a paradigm shift that would allow them not only in words and saying, oh yeah, conceptually I believe in non-segregated churches, but actually have the type of paradigm shift that would cause them to create church environments where that is actually happening, what would that paradigm shift be?
I would answer your question like this, Robbie. So when my husband and I were engaged to be married, we had to find a church together, which is like death to a newly engaged couple, right? Particularly if you go to two different churches, it's death. It's like, but you'll like my church. No, you'll like my church. We didn't like either one of our churches. And so we said, well, I guess we need to find a place to go together. And so my husband and I, again, my husband's white, we began, and I'm African-American, by the way, we began the search for a church. And so we would walk around, this is in 1999, when it was still a little strange to see a Black woman and a white man together. We would try to find a church. And our experience was we would go to the Black church and you would feel a little too Black for the Black church. We would go to the white church and you would feel too white for the Black church. Okay. You go to Asian American church, and you really stand out because we're both over 6 feet tall too, so we tend to stick. But you would do that, and then you would go to the Hispanic church, but you don't speak the language.
Yeah. For
couples like us at that time, where do we find a church where it feels like home to us? Mm-hmm. And we just couldn't find a church where people didn't stare at us. And then we thought, what if we have children, and I mean, we don't have any kids, but at that time we were like, if we had them, they're going to be these beautiful mocha peanut butter caramel mm-hmm. babies running around. Mm-hmm. And will our children spend their hour in Sunday school learning about the power of the blood of Christ? Or will they have to spend that hour answering the question, what are you? Right. And why are your mommy and daddy look different? And so when we found our home church at Bridgeway here in Maryland, it was the first church we walked into where we walked in and nobody stared at us because everybody looked like us. Mm-hmm. It was the first diverse church I ever went into. And so even back then in my experience, and I would appeal to the heart of a pastor, is, families like ours are coming to your church to see if they can find a home. And it doesn't matter to me that your building is sexy or what your missions program is, or, at that point, when you're a family like us, you just want to make sure you're safe and that you don't have to check part of your culture at the door, because that's not what Jesus asks us to do when we come to him. Right. So, that's how I would appeal to a shepherding pastor who loves people and wants to see the love of Christ manifest in the community of faith. Again, in this time in our world, people are coming here and we need to be ready for them. If 10 Syrian refugees showed up at your church, would you be ready for them? Because people are coming. Right. And we need to be ready to receive them with love and with learning so that the body of Christ can be together.
That's a great answer. Chris, did you have anything to hop in on that?
No, just to piggyback on what she said, I think it, and I said it earlier, it starts with, the shepherd, the pastor. I think it has to be something that's at the forefront of his mind. It's got to be something that is a burden on his heart. It can't be something that is like, I feel like I need to do this, but it's got to be a burden. It's got to be something that keeps you up at night. It's got to be something that you're constantly interrogating the mind of God. God, give me a strategy on how to create an authentic worship experience that people can come in and they don't think about color. They don't think about their differences. The only thing they think about is you. And so to me, that it has to start there. That's just me. I don't say that's not the only piece to the puzzle. But I just wanted to piggyback on that because that is an extremely important piece of that puzzle.
Absolutely. Well, let's take a quick break here and hear from today's sponsor. Hey, Praise Hands, if you are a forward-thinking Christian leader and you've got questions about this episode, another episode, or you just like to figure out how to implement these concepts in your life or your organization, I would love to meet you. You can visit thechurchahead.com to schedule a free 30-minute video call. Let's do it. Now back to our show. So we've talked about multicultural churches. Let's talk specifically about the worship aspect of that. What does it look like from a worship leader's role to create an experience in which someone can walk in from any cultural background and not feel like the other?
To me, I'm a student, so I study classical music in undergrad, but I grew up playing by ear in my mom's church in a Pentecostal church. So think about that.
Dual threat.
So it was a very complicated situation. Wow. But what it did is it taught me to be a student, and I could not go into my when I was in undergrad reading Bach. I couldn't go into that with a gospel ear because you can't improv on Bach. You have to actually have the discipline to sit down and become a student of that genre so that you can be authentic to it. And so that was a skill that I learned, and I've applied that when I'm like curating a worship experience. I have to make sure that I have been a student of all cultures. Mm-hmm. What works? What is it that they want to feel? What is it that they can relate to that is relevant to them, that gets them, whether it's from the instrumentation, how I approach, producing a track, how I approach, are we going to do all 4 of the verses, or are we going to do 2 verses and go ahead and get to the bridge and then go ahead and get to the vamp of the song? Mm-hmm. I'm always looking at it through all of those lenses to make sure that it is a corporate worship experience. Mm-hmm. The key word is corporate. Mm-hmm. And we miss that a lot, because a lot of times it is what I think, as a worship pastor, it is what I think worship is. Well, we live in a bubble as worship pastors. All we do is listen to worship music, but how do we curate it to where, the Hispanic brother and the Caucasian brother, or the African American or the Asian, that in this one song, in this one experience, there's something in it that I've intentionally committed to making sure that they can relate to. I think it is not accidental. I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but it is intentional to be a student of all of the people that you are endeavoring to reach. Because when you do that, it guarantees authenticity. I think that the goal needs to be authenticity. Mm-hmm. You don't have to, if it's authentic, red, yellow, black, and white, they'll connect to it.
Mm. Right.
That's, to me, how I approach it, and it is work, because you really have to study, man. You have to do life. I'm going to say that again. You got to do life with people that don't look like you.
Yeah.
And get outside of your circle or your bubble, and have lunch with somebody and talk. Hey, what does life look like? How is this? What is going on here? What do you listen to? Boom, boom, boom. Yep. And I think all of that becomes information that arms you as a worship pastor in like creating a corporate worship experience.
I would agree with Chris. I think I know as a worship pastor, every time I put a set together or an experience together, it was all in the goal to say, I see you.
Right.
And that's for anybody in the room. That's the beauty of the corporate worship experience. As Chris said, that language is very important, because even now, I don't want to go on a rabbit trail, but I think it's probably worth mentioning, even now, the local church is so, we are so influenced by industry, and oftentimes don't know how to separate the two between what we see in music industry and what is necessary for our local congregations. And a lot of times those things can be very different. Just because, these 5 hot songs are hot in, the country and for industry doesn't mean they're going to be hot in your congregation. You have to.
That's that bubble.
Right. You have to contextualize and know what is going to reach your congregation, and also what might stretch them a little as you shepherd them. But when you are putting a set together, a lot of people ask me sometimes, and when I do coaching, is every church called to be diverse, and why should we do this? And literally a lot of times my response is, why would you not want to do this? Like, as Chris says, there is so much to learn. There is so much to learn about this beautiful diversity within the body of Christ. I mean, to study the way that Sudanese believers express themselves. I was just at a conference in Michigan doing some speaking and some music. And on part of our team, there's a worship leader from Congo. And there was also a woman from Syria. And, when they get excited and they want to shout hallelujah, they don't just say hallelujah. They make sounds. And it's very loud and beautiful. Think about how that then broadens even your worship experience to allow people to include those things into your worship sets and into your culture at your churches. If you have people in your space that, that is their expression. I mean, there is so much to learn. And it's important for today's worship leader in local congregations to make sure that our only reference, going back to what Chris said, our only textbook, our only reference is not what we see on YouTube or what we hear on the local Christian radio station. That's like taking a college course and only reading a magazine to get your degree.
Yeah, everything she said is, I think it's our responsibility as worship leaders to disengage from our preference.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That is extremely hard, because there's nothing about that is consistent in any other aspect of our life.
Mm-hmm.
I can listen to a certain radio station because that's my preference. I can look at whether it be CNN or Fox News or any, because it's preference. I can eat at this pizza spot or this pizza because it's preference. But when it comes to what we do in the local church, if we're going to be effective, not dynamic, there's a difference between the two.
Yes.
We have to disengage from our preference.
You said if we're going to be what?
Effective, not dynamic. Effective. There's a huge difference between the two. And I think the modern culture is, we've kind of majored on being dynamic. And so you can have a dynamic worship experience, but if people are walking in bound and leaving bound, Houston, we have a problem. When it's effective, they are reminded of his nearness. The brokenhearted, they come into an encounter with the presence of God, the person that can put their whole lives back together. You cannot do that if you are building this worship experience within the context of your preference or what's hot.
Yes.
Because you're going to miss them. That's like a mass communicator you're only yelling or using, whatever. I mean, it's the same thing. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of say that.
To kind of summarize what I'm hearing you both say is, it really takes approaching how we build and design not only our church experiences but our worship experiences, and it takes seeing that through not a consumer lens but through a missional lens. Would that be a fair summary?
Oh, absolutely.
Well said.
Absolutely. I mean, when it comes down to it, if we are leaders in the church, we are shepherds. That is our responsibility. I believe in the Ephesians 4 model of leadership, right? Which is, our work is to equip the people for the works of service, and to add to that, to point them to Jesus. Like that is our goal. And I think
that's it.
Right? Yeah. Like again, I'm telling you, industry is so influential, and I don't even blame the industry. I'm just gonna say it. I blame a laziness, God's people and God's leaders, because also, I used to tell people, I used to say, I'm going to out myself, right? As a worship pastor, I said, 90% of what we sing, I don't like. I wouldn't listen to it necessarily in my own worship time, right? Usually if I listen, these days in my spiritual walk, I usually listen to instrumental music more than anything else. Again, Chris's record. If you don't have it, by the way, please go get it. But I can listen to Chris's piano record for my worship time, which I do often. Yeah. And that music brings a spirit about who Christ is and an intention, but it also gives me space to allow the Spirit to tell me who he is. So, But think about it for a minute though. If as a worship pastor, I approached my role as, well, I'm the worship pastor, so we're just going to do all the stuff I like. All of our stuff at church would sound like slow, meditative, like no words, like let's
spa music.
Exactly, spa music, right? Because that's what I like. It would be, smooth jazz and snarky puppy. Like that would be.
I'd go to that church.
Yeah, me too, right? But again, that's not my role. And even though I wouldn't listen to a lot of the things, it doesn't mean I can't worship God. I can, because I'm in a leadership role. Can you imagine if your pastor opened up their Bible and the only passages they ever shared with the congregation were their favorite? Mm-hmm. Like that, worship leaders, if we're not careful, that's where we fall into. Because for lots of people, our local church roles that we find ourselves in, we slowly over time start to see that thing as our platform.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
that is not what Jesus has asked us to do. It's Jesus's platform. It's his church. Always has been, always will be. And that platform is to be shared and stewarded with the community of faith. And so for worship leaders to look at that platform as not yours to make a name for yourself, but to make much of who Christ is. And so then the questions become less about, well, how can I do what I like, or how I sound good, or what my favorite song is, so that, you know, we can take the roof off of this place. You know, that's not the goal.
Right.
The goal is, what do we need to sing as a community? You know, how does our worship move us towards Jesus in times of trauma and crisis, and what our community is going through? That is why God has given us these platforms to steward, not so that we can push our own musical fantasies, around. I mean, there are other venues for that.
Right.
But for our local church, it has to be about the community, and it has to be about, what do we need to sing in this season of ministry? And from a culture standpoint, how many different ways could we sing it and express it so that people can all find their place and that they don't have to check their culture at the door?
That's so good.
For the worship leaders out there that are listening to this and saying, man, I don't know how. I mean, this is a lot. How do I even begin to curate my worship set or worship experience based on kind of the information that we've shared? One thing that I do, because I'm a method type guy. I study methods, because if I can ever get the method, if I can get the pattern, then I have an understanding, and I can kind of, now I can do my own thing with it. But I no longer look at people through the lens of red, yellow, black, and white. It's because that's very broad. Now, I believe in doing life. I believe in everything that I've shared earlier. I'm just going to give you a quick tip to do that I've used in it, and it helps me. I divide people into two categories. I divide them into categories of thinkers and fillers. Thinkers and fillers. They are people that are stimulated from the thought, from the lyrical content of a song. When you begin to take a song and you can talk about how beautiful God is and do it and just express it from a lyrical content, there are people that's what works for them. Then there's another set of people that are called fillers. Fillers are like, okay, I'm cool with the thinking part, but I want you to sing this one little chorus over and over and over again, because the more you sing it, I begin to feel it. It begins to resonate, and it begins to resonate in me. And so when I'm taking a song, like, for example, I'll take a song like Mighty to Save. Everybody knows that. Everybody loves that song. I may not do all of the verses.
Sure.
Because if I do all of the verses, the fillers are like, I just want to get to the shine a light and let the whole world, I need to hear that more.
Right.
So when I'm curating that song, I am making sure that I'm taking a balanced approach to it, so that I'm not leaving the thinkers out and I'm not leaving the fillers out. So if that means you changing maybe the vibe of the song, the rhythmic approach to the song, singing two of the verses, going to the bridge, and then getting to the event, you have to, it takes that level of intent to create a really corporate experience. So I just divide people into two categories, the thinkers and the fillers. In this song, how do I hit my thinkers? How do I hit my fillers? In this next song, how do I hit my thinkers? How do I hit my fillers? If I am teaching, if I'm preaching, how am I stimulating my thinkers, and how am I getting my fillers? I think that's an easier way to kind of get to a multicultural or a corporate worship experience.
That's gold right there.
Awesome.
Chris, you're a part of a project with MultiTracks.com called The Recording Collective, and you guys have an EP that released February 8th. First of all, congratulations, and I'm sure anybody that's put out any project of any nature knows it takes a lot to get from the start line to the finish line. So, what's your heart behind this project, and what role did you play? What are your hopes for this project?
Man, I think the heart behind it is to be a resource to the local church and those that are endeavoring to kind of be that bridge experience for people that love CCM, that love gospel, that love different styles. And there's not a lot of material out there. Of course, like you said at the beginning, Israel was like, the godfather at taking material and, whether it was Here I Am to Worship or In Jesus' Name, and just, flipping it in a manner in which it worked in all settings. And so it was more so to take a lot of these very popular songs like No Longer Slaves or, I Am Who You Say I Am, What a Beautiful Name, different songs, and to kind of give it a treatment that will make it sit easier in a multicultural setting. Not changing the lyrics of the song, not even as a producer, I never want to take away from the writer's intent. That's just something that I want to stay true to that, but to kind of take it and treat it in a manner in which maybe the guitars are not going to be in the first 4 bars of the song. Maybe that may be a Hammond organ there. Sure. It's a different treatment to it. So that's the heart for it, man. To just provide a resource for those that are kind of living in that space, that are wanting something, a new treatment on these songs that can work in a multicultural, cross-cultural space.
That's great. So where can people learn more about this project?
Dude, you can go to MultiTracks.com. They have the press release. They're kind of giving in-depth what to our approach to it. They can go there. Of course, the music is going to be on Spotify, all the digital outlets as well. And so we're super duper excited, man. It was a labor of love, but to be able to do this with a lot of my friends from around the country that have a real burden for everything that we've talked about today. I think it was a blessing to be a part of something, and I'm really grateful for MultiTracks just kind of leading this charge, because it's something that is definitely needed in the local church.
No, that's great. That's super good. Nikki, how can people learn more about you, your network, and your coaching?
Yeah, thanks for that. The best thing to do right now is to connect with me via my website, NikkiLerner.com. It's NikkiLerner.com. And there you can find music, and coaching is a big part of what I do. Culture coach to help empower people learn how to understand each other. So I can come to your city or to your church and do consulting and team training. I have a band that follows with me when we go to creative teams and all that good stuff. And we're also doing music outside of the church, speaking in the language of people that we find in a bar or, somewhere. Everybody knows the language of love, compassion, pain, and trying to minister there too. So, but NikkiLerner.com is the place to find me.
That's so good. So any closing thoughts from you guys? If there's one thing you had to say to the world that's listening here about this whole intersection of multiculturalism, church, and worship, what's your closing thought?
I would say we have to stay engaged around this issue. It can be scary sometimes, and depending on your culture in our country, your level of threat to engage in this conversation could be higher than another's. But it is imperative for us that know Jesus to stay engaged on this topic and to keep challenging ourselves and our congregations on what God would want for his kids, whether to worship together or to worship separately. I would also just say this work is hard. It is not the road easiest traveled. But I will tell you, as someone working in this space for over 20 years, it is the best work that I do. So that's what I would say. So keep at it, everybody. You can do it. I'm cheering loudly for you from Maryland.
Yeah. So good.
Yeah, I would just say, it's to lean into this tension. Like Nikki said, it will never be just easy. When you start to have conversations, especially in America, about race relations and just the multicultural experience, I think sometimes we want to kind of avoid that tension, and that's not realistic. It's a tension that has to be managed. So to lean into it, to realize that it will always be, some tension there, but to manage it. And I believe it is God's intent for us to worship him together. And I said that at the beginning. So just to kind of lean into that tension, keep moving forward. I think by having conversations like this, and to Robbie, thank you. This is an amazing resource because I had no idea that it existed, but as a worship pastor, it's something that will be food for me in my endeavor to constantly move this thing, forward. So I would say just to kind of continue moving forward with it.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. And it's such an honor to have you guys. I think you guys brought up so many important points that I think a lot of our listeners are really going to have to stew on and think about, and I don't think you can talk about a topic like this and not be stirred in some way. So I appreciate not only what you both shared today, but the journeys both of you have walked through to get to where you are today and blazing the trail for so many. So thank you guys so much. And I don't know what to say next.
God bless.
God bless America. Man, I just love the maturity, the honesty, and the humility that both Chris and Nikki have. If you want to learn more about them and their projects, we'll go ahead and put all that info in the show notes. I want to give you a little info about next week's episode, but before I do, I'm going to unapologetically ask for your help. If you believe in the heart behind this podcast, there are 3 ways that you can get the word out. First, share this episode. As you listen, I'm sure you realize that there are some friends you've got that need to hear this. Secondly, if you can take a moment to subscribe and also rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you're listening, that would be huge for us. Lastly, and I'm probably breaking every marketing rule by telling you this, but as of this recording, we are on Instagram as @PraiseHandsPodcast, and we've got 52 followers. We're like the new kid at school eating lunch by himself who needs more friends. So let's connect. There'll be a party. Next week on the Praise Hands podcast, our guest will be American Idol finalist Clark Beckham. In this episode, Clark shares how music enables him to create common ground in a world that desperately needs it. Tune in next Thursday and be inspired to do the same. This is the Praise Hands podcast, and I'm your host, Robbie Valderrama. We'll see you next week.